Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today's episode is the life and career of George Jones, so stick around. But first, I've got some dates coming up, so come out and see me. We're doing May 10th, I'll be at Rancho Roble Vineyards in Lincoln, and May 31st, I'll be at the Reno River Festival in Reno. And then into June, I'll be at the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival in Knights Ferry, California. June 14th, I'll be at the Colusa County Fair. And June 20th, I'll be back at Red Bus Brewing, so come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing. And tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Okay. All right. So George Jones is another one of these characters in country music who he comes in the kind of early 50s. So he's bouncing off of a bunch of different people that we've already talked about in previous episodes. But so he's born in 1931. He's born in Saratoga, Texas, which I guess was referred to as the Big Thicket, which I guess is this area of Texas. It's like, heavily wooded, and there's like a big logging industry there. But apparently it's got its own pretty tight subculture in this area. Like, it was kind of very different. People describe it different ways, but I heard one description of it that it was like established by people who were like running from the law in Texas. And so they all kind of had their own way of handling justice and, like town affairs. So it's kind of this sort of, sequestered community. And so that's where he's born. And then his, around the time he's like 9 or 10, I think they move kind of into town, into Beaumont, Texas. Which, okay, so his childhood seems pretty kind of standard for these kind of guys at the time. So there's nothing crazy. I guess his dad was a heavy drinker, so there's that. So, and his dad was kind of this very hot, very cold character. He was either like super cool guy to be around, or when he's drinking, he was a little bit of a problem, which he would pass that on to George Jones. That's going to be a theme. But anyway, and I guess there was an older sister who died, and I haven't found anything to clarify if that was before George Jones was born or not. Like, I think that was before his memory of her. But anyway, so this oldest child dies and kind of has a really negative impact on his dad. And so he kind of wears that along. And so George Jones quit school after, I think, 7th grade. So, and which is, I guess, not super uncommon for the time. So, he's 12, 13, something like that. Quit school, and he starts playing guitar. He picked a guitar up when he was like 9. And by the time he's 12, 13 years old, he starts just riding on buses. He'd just get on the bus with his guitar and play for people, and they'd give him money, and he'd kind of just get off one bus, get on to the next one. And it became such a routine for him that the bus drivers wouldn't even charge him. They just knew, hey, that's the guitar kid. And he'd just show up and play, and people gave him money. And he made, I think he said at one point he made like $27 or something in one day. And that was in the 1940s. That's way more money than he'd ever seen. And this is part of the reason why they moved to Beaumont was because this was during World War II. And so there was like this big industrial boom. And that's kind of what his dad was working during that industrial boom. So that's kind of where the money started coming from. And but so he pretty much doesn't ever do anything other than music in his, in that time frame. And he's playing in local honky tonks and stuff. And he actually gets a radio gig at this local radio station in Beaumont, Texas. And it's during this time. So George Jones idolized Hank Williams to the, like, almost self-destructively so. Like he loved Hank Williams. He loved everything about him. He loved his music. He loved his lifestyle. He loved his personality, and was very, like, vocal about that. If people were to ask him, like, who his influences were, it was like him and Lefty Frizzell and Roy Acuff. And but he loved Hank Williams. Well, one day Hank Williams comes through Beaumont, Texas, and I guess Hank had established a friendship with the owner of that radio station. And so he comes in one day to, like, and George Jones is supposed to get to play with him on the show, and he describes being so, like, caught off guard and so starstruck that he kind of just stood there the whole time and didn't even play a note on his guitar, and Hank just did his number, and George just kind of stood there like, But then after the fact, I guess he got a chance to really sit with Hank, and Hank was giving him advice, like, because at the time, George Jones's voice is, I mean, as everybody knows now, he's got one of the biggest ranges of country music in that time. His highs were really high, his lows are really low. And but at the time, he was really singing in the top end of his register, and he was trying really hard to sound like Hank Williams and Roy Acuff and Lefty Frizzell, to the point where that was the feedback he was getting, was like, hey man, we already have that. Like, we have a Hank Williams, we have a Lefty Frizzell, you got to be you. And it took him a minute to figure that out. But Hank Williams himself reiterates that advice to George Jones and is like, hey man, like, what you got to do is figure out how to be yourself. And once you figure that out, it's, you're on your way. And that, hearing it from Hank really seems to have struck a chord with George Jones. So they have this, I think it was in 1949 that they met. And this is, I mean, the peak, just about the peak of Hank's career. He's going on to all kinds of success right in this time. And so then George Jones, when he's 18 years old, he meets and quickly marries a girl named Dorothy Bonvillian, I think is how you say it, and Dorothy. And but they basically get married, she gets pregnant, and then they get divorced, like, immediately. Like, it's a quick blip of a marriage, but they have a kid who he, describes, he seems to have had a somewhat stable relationship with that daughter kind of the whole way through here. But so he's 18 years old, he's got an ex-wife and a kid, and he's having trouble paying his alimony because he's just doing music stuff. So he decides this is a good time to join the Marines. And this was in 1951, 52, somewhere in there. And so he joins the Marines specifically because he can't pay his alimony. Like, that's the whole reason he does this. And he thought the Marines would kind of help straighten him out. And which it doesn't, but it performed the function of getting him out of town for a little bit. And so he goes, and so this is during the Korean War. But he ends up not getting sent to Korea. He just gets sent to San Jose, California, which is near where I grew up, which I didn't know until I was doing research for this. So he spends 2 years in San Jose. And it's while he's there, I guess, and he kept playing gigs around San Jose, and, like, he billed himself as Little Georgie, something like, yeah, like, it was like Little Georgie Jones, he had, like, a nickname going. It was basically like a play on Little Jimmy Dickens, and he's wearing his, rhinestone shirt and everything. But he's not collecting very much of a following at this point. And he describes it's during that time he's sitting on the bed in his barracks room, and his friend comes in and just throws a newspaper on the bed, and it's that Hank Williams died in the backseat of his Cadillac. So that would have been New Year's Day of 1953. And George Jones just comes apart, and he spends the rest of that day just crying in his bunk because that was his idol. That was his, his musical hero. And he died in the backseat of his car. And that, like, it's easy to kind of, like, bump over that. And, like, to just kind of disregard kind of how much of an impact that would be. Like, lots of people have, like, people get attached to celebrities and people get excited about stuff. This was different. I mean, imagine what it would take to make you ball up and cry all day long when you're an otherwise pretty emotionally tough dude. I mean, it's not like George had not seen, his share of tragedy and adversity in life up to this point. It's just like that was just his hero died young. And it really just center punches him, and he has this emotional kind of breakdown over it. And but anyway, he does continue on. But keep that in mind, that when George Jones is 18 years old, he has this image of his hero dying in the backseat of his car due to a drug and alcohol overdose. So he does his 2 years in the Marines, and then he goes back to Beaumont, Texas. He, and then at this point, he'd gotten enough of a reputation before he left that there was a company called Star Day Records, I think. They were like this tiny little record label. When they heard he was coming back, they kind of picked him up immediately. Like as soon as he got back to town, they were like, hey, would you want to, work with us? So he jumps immediately into the music scene with this tiny little record label out of Beaumont. And that, so his first record, I think, was called, No Money in This Deal. And that was so the song comes out in 1954. So he signs with them end of 1953. Song comes out in 1954. And he starts, developing somewhat of a local following here. And this is where he's starting to build some steam. And let's see here. He gets married again in 1954. He gets married to a lady named Shirley Ann Corley. They have another couple of kids. And then 1955 is when things really start to kind of shift gears. So he releases Why Baby Why in 1955. And that's the first time that he really kind of hits the top end of the chart. I think he got number 4 on the Billboard charts with that one. And the thing about George Jones during this time is that while there were other people really already trying to this attitude of like the Nashville machine kind of forming artists to what it wanted. And there was some pushback against that. This is when you have guys like Buck Owens and Merle Haggard and things like they're kind of a rebellion against that machine. George Jones seems to have had no issue playing ball. Whatever the machine wanted, he tried. And if it worked, it worked. And if it didn't, he adapted. And but he doesn't ever seem to have had any fight with the machinery here. So to the point where at one point they tried. So imagine this is like Elvis is a huge deal at this point. So Elvis Presley is the one record label executive described it as that rock and roll was eating our lunch. He was like, we could barely sell records. He said, if we put on a show, we had to bill 4 names just to sell tickets because they're competing with prime Elvis Presley. So country music's having a hard time. So they kind of went through a phase of, if you can't beat them, join them. And so they kind of tried to turn George Jones into this like rockabilly character. And so he releases a rockabilly out, so I don't know if it was a full album, but it was at least a couple of songs under the pseudonym Thumper Jones, which they're already trying to, it's kind of like them hedging their bets. It's like, okay, if we give him a pseudonym, but it's still half tied to him, so people know this is George Jones. But then if it doesn't work, we haven't damaged the George Jones brand. We'll just burn the Thumper Jones brand if it doesn't work. And that's kind of exactly what happens. Like George Jones looks back on this as he hates the way it turned out. He hates listening to those songs from himself back then. And so the Thumper Jones thing does not stick. That doesn't work. And but okay, so then we get in kind of the later 1950s. During this time is when he's bouncing off of some other famous characters. So like him and Johnny Cash start hanging out together in the late 50s here. And this is, him and Johnny Cash, all these guys together. It's like George Jones, Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, and a couple other guys. They're all kind of riding the wave of success and substance abuse at the same time, kind of in different gears and different speeds, but all at the same time. And so Johnny Cash has a hilarious interview where he's like, we drank together, we took pills together, we got in trouble together, we had lots of pain together, but lots of good times, and like kind of nods it off. Also, in the late 1950s, it sounds like late 50s, early 60s, George Jones ends up on tour with Buck Owens. So we have another tie into a previous episode. And this is right when like Buck Owens is doing the Buckaroos thing, like in that kind of first phase. This is right after Merle Haggard had played bass for him. They're the Buckaroos now, and they're out there touring and doing stuff. Well, George Jones is one of their opening acts. But George Jones kind of he's getting hits enough that he kind of sees himself as equal with Buck Owens. And he starts complaining, like, how come I always have to open the show? Like, why don't you open for me one day? And Buck is like, no. Like, you go on first, I'll go on second. And so then one day, George Jones gets drunk and he goes up to Buck Owens and he says, you come watch my show, and by the end of it, you won't even want to go up there. You'll let me close next time. George Jones walks out on stage and performs Buck Owens' set, sings all of his songs, sings none of his own songs, and just does all of Buck Owens' show. Says, thanks, everybody, walks off the stage and looks at Buck and goes, your turn. And so that, like, which he looks back on and laughs at. But, I mean, yeah. So they're, and just you can imagine, like, you think you're going to a Buck Owens show and, like, there's George Jones just completely doing the wrong set. And then I'm sure, I don't know what Buck Owens did. I don't know if he went on and performed his stuff or if he tried to pull off some of George's songs. I don't know. But anyway, it's something that they both look back and laugh at now. But I bet that was something to see at the time. Yeah, just a wild bunch of years here. And the thing about George Jones at this stage of his life is that the alcohol has reared its head a few times now. And George is not a happy drunk. He's like a get mean and fight everybody type of drunk. And he's got like, he himself describes it as like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, where like when he's not drunk, he's this sweet, loving, positive guy. And when he's drinking, he is a nightmare. I mean, he's just fighting everybody. Later in the story, he's shooting guns at his friends. He's doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But he's starting to develop a little bit of a reputation as a problem already in the late 50s. And so, but it's the same thing as Hank Williams here, where like, as his substance abuse and like just self-destructive stuff is going off the deep end, his career is going the opposite direction. And really, he's hitting number one. He's doing, he's having all this crazy success and money coming in as he's starting to really drive himself to the ground drinking. And so his marriage to Shirley Corley ends specifically because of his alcoholism. That's in 1968. And this is, there's another, he's playing on the Opry all the time. And Tender Years, oh yeah, that's right. So 1961, a few years before, Tender Years hits number one. And that's like his first big number one hit. And so he's becoming kind of a regular on the Opry. His drinking's become a bit of an issue, but he's kind of holding it together. And his marriage is crumbling out from underneath him. And so in walks Tammy Wynette to his life. Now, Tammy Wynette was married to a guy named Don Chappell at the time. And Don Chappell, his name will pop up in other stories that we do because I think he was a producer, but also a songwriter. So he was pitching songs to artists during this time. And George Jones recorded a few of his songs kind of as this is all going on. But if you see pictures of him, like, he's got this ridiculous blonde wig that he wears, and he's wearing it like unironically. Like he's trying to pass it off as his hair, but it's just clearly not. And and he's this tall, lanky, bad wig, blue nudie suit looking dude. And who, like I said, seems to have written some decent songs, and so he's kind of professionally sort of respected, but in a bunch of different interviews, you can see people kind of talking about him as if they're sort of writing him off. And but they're running side by side for a while here. So he's married to Tammy Wynette, and George Jones is in a crumbling marriage also. And then the fireworks start happening between George and Tammy. And there's a couple of different accounts of how that exactly got going. But George Jones describes one day sort of passing a message along to Tammy because, they hadn't had very many like one-on-one interactions. And there was, I think it was the title of a song that was like, "She's married, but I love her still," or something. And George Jones tells one of the other guys in the crew to tell that to Tammy. And he does. And it was like 5 minutes later, Tammy is at George's trailer. And, things are moving. So it sounds like they started an affair pretty quick after that. And it continues on kind of right under Don Chappell's nose. So this is not one of these things that like Don Chappell is aware of immediately. And there's a bunch of kind of hilarious, but probably a little over the top for this show stories that come out of this time. Like there's some hilarious accounts of the sort of steamy interactions between George Jones and Tammy Wynette that are worth a listen. And but anyway, so some time goes on, this continues, and Don Chappell makes the mistake of inviting George Jones over for dinner to pitch him a song one day. And this is, I think, in let's see here, 1969. Yeah. So 1969, Don Chappell makes the mistake of inviting George Jones over for dinner to pitch him some songs. And so they had a couple, so Tammy Wynette had a couple of kids. She had 3 kids, I think, at this point. And so George walks into the house, they're having dinner, and George is drinking already. Like we're knee deep in, willing to fight people phase here. So he shows up at Tammy Wynette's house. Here's the woman that he loves and her husband. And at some point during the dinner, Don Chappell says something to Tammy Wynette that was, he called her a name, or he was just talking down to her in a way that George Jones didn't like. And he decides, I've had enough of that, gets up, flips the kitchen table over, throws a chair through the window, and which apparently sort of caught Don Chappell off guard. And he was like, what are you worried about here? Because he thought he was just having a spat with his wife in front of a friend. Well, George Jones wasn't having it, and it kind of catches Don Chappell off guard. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, because I love her, and if you're going to talk to her like that, I'm taking her." And then he kind of just says, "Get in the truck, Tammy," and she grabs the kids, and they leave, like right out of a movie. Like, dude said something off color to Tammy, and George just wasn't having it. Flipped the table, grabs her, grabs the kids. They all leave, and they set off on this span of a few years here that are kind of the highlight of George's life and career up to that point, because Tammy Wynette was already super famous, and so was George Jones. So this was like they were kind of the king and queen of country music anyway, and now they're together, and they start making music together, they get married, and to the point where George Jones had to pay a bunch of money to his record label to release him from a contract so that he could record with Tammy Wynette. And this, there's a little bit of mixed reporting here, because on the one hand, it sounds like he sort of cleaned his act up for a few years here, that like he had very few, if any, falls off the wagon. He does describe later on that like, well, when we drove to the chapel, I had a 5th of whiskey between my legs and a bottle of 7-Up, and she didn't seem to mind it then, but it would become an issue. So even though she knew he was a heavy drinker at the time, she hitches her wagon to him, and they get married, and they have a few years here where things are going pretty well. But at the same time, Tammy Wynette starts experiencing some pretty severe health issues. Like she's having, she has to get her appendix removed at one point. She's having like other issues like this. And this is, an appendectomy in the 70s is not a good time. But she's dealing with it, and they're still continuing to travel and, put on shows, and they're on the road together, and things are going pretty well. But the stress from the medical issues seems to have a part in knocking George off the wagon. And this is where it's a little bit tragic, because during this time they had moved around a little bit to sort of avoid George's problems. So like they moved away from Nashville and they moved to Florida to like get him away from his drinking buddies and kind of start fresh, sort of. And then at one point, I think they moved back to Tennessee for a similar reason. Like, it doesn't seem to fully fix the problem. But Tammy's given George the ultimatum, and she said, it's either me or the booze, and you got to pick. And so he picks Tammy, and he seems to straighten himself up after a while. But then he has, I can't remember if there was something specific that, knocks him off the wagon. And remember, during this time, he's still at the peak of fame. Like, him and Tammy are cranking out records, and they're doing the dang thing. Like, this is, career-wise, very high. But something in here knocks George off the wagon. And he describes knowing that he screwed up. He's drunk as hell, feeling down about it, and he decides, I'm going to sleep this off and call Tammy in the morning. And he does something like, this is where I think there's a little bit of tragedy in here, because what he does is he calls her in the morning and he immediately apologizes. And he's like, hey, I fell off the wagon. I'm really sorry. Like that, And I think this is where Tammy Wynette hits a fork in the road, where she could have, it does take a lot for an alcoholic or an addict to have that conversation at all, to even fess up to the fact that they're off the wagon and that this happened. And that maybe in that moment, if she'd have been a little bit softer, she could have done more to bring out the best in George Jones. She does not pick that route. She says, you're never coming in the house again. Just full send, locks him out. Marriage is over. You screwed up. You're done. And she just nails him with it. So George Jones is now off the wagon with zero reasons to get back on the wagon. And he proceeds to just spiral. And this is post Tammy Wynette marriage. This is where you get some wild footage of George Jones and some crazy stories that are happening. Because like I said, he's just full self-destruct mode. He was, by all accounts, madly in love with Tammy Wynette. And when that ended, it really, it just split him down the middle. Because he continues, playing shows, but his drinking has just become a real problem. And this is kind of during this time. So I think they get divorced in 1975. And this is where he starts getting the name No Show Jones, because he would just disappear for days, weeks, or a couple months at a time and show back up like nothing happened. And, he was getting sued left and right from promoters. He was getting sued by record company. He was getting sued by everybody because he's not meeting his contractual obligations. He's incurring a bunch of debt because he's just buying stuff that he doesn't need. Because at this point, George Jones seems to feel like his level of fame and his level of financial success is undeserved. He's pretty down on himself about it. So he does these self-destructive things to kind of balance the scales out, to the point where they're flat broke during this time. Like, George Jones has no dollars. And so him and his band are traveling around. And at one point, and this is after he was the king of country music, married to Tammy Wynette, money's coming in, no big deal, finds himself flat broke. And there's a interaction between him and his bandmates where they all they had enough money to get to some gig in Florida or something. And they had 37 cents between them. And George Jones picks it up and he's like, well, if we're going to be broke, we're going to be broke all the way. And hucks it out the window, which was also something that might have fueled that decision. This is the time when George Jones discovers cocaine. And that happened pretty soon after his split from Tammy Wynette. It doesn't sound like he had ever tried it before that. It was around, but he had never he almost acts like he'd never heard of it. Cocaine was not super prevalent in the 60s, I guess, late 50s, early 60s. But by 1975, it's around. And his drinking is really having the effect that drinking seems to have on most guys. It's ruining his voice. It's taking all his energy. He's not eating. He's not sleeping. He just looks like hell. And then this club promoter he opens up a club with a guy. I didn't write his. I know they call him Shug, but I don't remember what his last name was. And they open this thing called I think it was the Possum Holler is the name. They're the Possum Holler Club. Which, in case you don't know, George Jones, his nickname was the Possum. And it's kind of funny if you look back and watch people describe why. And his bandmates are all just, they're almost rude about it. They're like, yeah, because his eyes are too close together. He looks like a possum. Like, no wonder he got that name. Like, they're just super down the middle with it. Like, yeah, it's because of his nose and his eyes are too close together, which is, I mean, just hilarious to like listen back to those guys describing that. But anyway, so Possum Holler was his, kind of brand. And so when that club opens, that's where he discovers cocaine, was with this guy that was, kind of running that club with him. And there's some wild footage of a coked up George Jones playing at Possum Holler. And you kind of get an idea where like, oh, okay, this is the speed he was at. Because he is performing. Like, cocaine did have the desired effect of like picking him up and moving him on, and he got shows done. And even when he is blacked out drunk, for whatever reason, George Jones, his autopilot is so good that most of the time, even when he's blacked out, vocally he does just fine. And he keeps his show going enough to sell tickets for the most part. I mean, obviously, when he's no-showing these shows, people are there waiting for him, so it's not a selling tickets problem. He's able to pull the show off, even when he is just coke to the gills and drinking everything he can get his hands on. And so, like I said, he starts to spiral further and further and further down the line. Now, as this is happening, he's having a lot of trouble. So he's picking good songs, but he's having a lot of trouble getting them recorded. And so to the point where the song He Stopped Loving Her Today is written. Not by George Jones. I have it here somewhere. I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote it. But it's pitched to George Jones, and he likes the song, kind of. But it took them like 18 months to get the song recorded. From the first day in the studio to the final production was like more than a year. Because they kept making writing changes. George kept making changes, and he'd show up too wrecked to do anything. And he would like get one or two lines squeaked out, and then his voice is done, and he's like, so that song is being written and produced and recorded right when George Jones is knee deep in cocaine and booze and just living the rock star life and, just running himself into the ground. And, but it does get done, and it is a smash hit. It's his biggest hit of his career. And there's there's awards that follow, and he's getting all same thing. The career has continued to ratchet up while his personal life has continued to ratchet down. And like, if you go back and watch his acceptance speeches for some of these awards he's getting, he clearly is not having a good time, but he's pulling it together. And he kind of knows it at this point too. Like, at one point there was I thought it wasn't when it might have been for a Grammy, I think. But anyway, there's footage of him sitting in the audience, and the next act came up, and she was like, "Oh, come up and sing this with me, George." And he's like, "Nope, nope, nope." He's like pointing to his voice, like, "Oh, I can't do it." But she kind of won't let up, and she kind of pulls him onto the stage, and he, they bring the mic down to him, and he kept trying to say no. And then he's sort of like, all right. And then he kind of gets up there and half mumbles out a couple lines during this song. But she took it like a champ, and so did the audience. But everybody kind of knew, like, oh, George is he's a little too messed up to do this. I mean, he knew. He was trying to wave him off the whole time. And then for his acceptance speech, he like barely pulls it off. He gets up there and he's just like, oh, thanks so much. I love the fans and everything. And then he just sees a couple of people in the front row that he recognized and like thanked them, even though they weren't really involved in that song. And that was kind of that's emblematic of where he was at the time. Just this kind of train wreck. This is also the time during which there's great footage of George Jones getting a DUI, which is, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious because, I mean, he has this, and you can kind of see, if you go back and watch his DUI footage, you see the kind of blackness behind his eyes, and he's just wanting to fight everybody, and he's just yelling at the cops and whacking at cameras, and he's having not a good time. It's pretty intense. I mean, it's funny because he survives it and he goes on. There are brighter days ahead of him at that time, but he doesn't know it, and it's he's in the bottom. Uh, Also, like there's there somewhere in here there's a time where like his sister and his brother-in-law seem to have been really like positive, influences during his life, and they're always trying to help him, and they're always trying to get him back on track. So at one point they try to like make him dry out, and they like get him in the house, and they move all his vehicles, they take away any means to get to town, they clear all the booze out of the house, and they're kind of like trying to lock him down and make him dry out. And his brother-in-law is staying with him in the house, and that works for about a couple of days, and then George decides, I'm going to get a drink. Like, he's not, as happens with alcoholics, like that. Good luck forcing an alcoholic to get sober by just locking him down like that, because he finds a way out, and he finds a riding lawnmower with the keys in it, and he just decides that'll work, gets on a riding lawnmower and drives to town. And or at least gets far enough away that then he like thumbs a ride into town, and then he gets booze and he's back off the wagon, he disappears for a while, and then he shows back up a few days later. And like, so it had almost no positive effect here. And this is also somewhere in here, there's a couple of like, so 1978, also in the throes of this time period, he records Bartender's Blues, which that was it's a great song. It was written by James Taylor, which sort of shows like everybody sort of acknowledged that at the time, George Jones was the best voice in country music. I mean, he was widely described as the greatest of all time. Even then, even in the like knee deep in addiction and alcoholism, he's widely described as the greatest to ever do it. Just because of his voice and his ability to perform. And like Johnny Cash tells a story of like Elvis Costello is in the studio watching George record, and Elvis Costello is crying and is just like toasting him, like, he's the greatest to ever do it, and just kind of having an emotional moment. And like Johnny's just kind of laughing and like, yeah, and but so like, so he had a lot of crossover with like him, the Beatles loved him, and Elvis Costello, and then James Taylor writes this song for him, and it's it's a smash hit also. But shortly thereafter, in 1978, I think ish, he has a friend named Peanut Montgomery. His name was Earl Peanut Montgomery. And I think he was a songwriter, but they performed together. He was kind of around on the road with George Jones. And Peanut decides that he's going to get religion and sober up. And he does. And so usually when you do that around a severe alcoholic, they don't like that juxtaposition. So somehow there's a confrontation between them, and where Peanut's basically telling George, like, no, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, I've been saved and I'm not doing this anymore. And that pissed George off enough. He pulls out a 38 and shoots it over the top of Peanut's car, and cocked it again, and was like getting ready to fire again. And then just had this moment where like, it's this weird, it seems to happen a couple of different times here, where like George is in just like black-eyed demon mode, firing guns at his friends, and then something switches, like in the moment that he cocked the hammer for the next round, and he goes, Peanut, I'm going to go inside. And Peanut's like, yeah, you do that. And so he leaves. Peanut reports it to the sheriff, but then doesn't press charges. So that's the kind of thing that George is into. He also, during this time, shows up at Waylon Jennings' house. They were kind of neighbors, I guess. They lived close enough together that you could get drunk and stumble over there. And Waylon was in the throes of his own fight with addiction. Like, I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. But like, so Waylon tells the story. He was like, I was high, but George was drunker than I was high. And then he came in the house, and, basically George Jones just like goes inside and starts having a come apart, tearing up Waylon's house and swinging at Waylon. And the bass player was there, and like, he like kicked the bass player in the hand and broke his thumb or something. So like Waylon just gets a hold of him and kind of gets him on the floor, and he's trying to be like, just subduing him. And then George Jones starts like choking and like, and so it kind of freaks Waylon out. He's like, George, are you okay? And as soon as he lets go, Jones comes up and knocks Waylon in the jaw one time. And then Waylon's back on top of him, holding him down. And so now he's, everybody's in this tussle, and Waylon starts saying that, he's like, whatever he's on is outlasting whatever I'm on. So we need to get something to tie him up. So they tie him up with a belt and they throw him on the couch. And they tell this story now, chuckling, like, or not now. I mean, in later years, they would go on to tell the story laughing about it. But at the time, that's pretty intense. And so they call his manager, and his manager comes over to kind of collect him up. And at that point, he'd kind of slept it off a little bit. So they untie him, and he gets up, and there's that switch again. He went from fighting his friends to he switches back on, and he goes, hey, you want to play that song for me again? The one that you wrote about the thing? Like there was some song that he had, that I guess Waylon was working on. I don't know. And so he just snapped into music guy mode again and was just like not confrontational at all, which, I mean, that's, I guess, cocaine and booze for you. But anyway, so that's the kind of havoc he's, involved in. And so he files for bankruptcy in 1979 because of all this stuff. I mean, he'd been buying cars, and he'd been buying houses, and he'd been doing all kinds of things. Like I said, because he seems to have been caught in this self-destructive loop where he feels like he's undeserving of his success, to the point where, we kind of skipped over this a little bit. During this time, the cocaine and booze have the bizarre effect of splitting his personality. So, one of the he had two alter personalities in his head. One was what they called the old man, and one was Donald Duck. So there was a phase of time where George Jones, just yeeted out of his mind on cocaine, is driving around in his car having a three-way conversation with himself as him, the old man, and Donald Duck. And he's speaking all three parts in conversation, and it would just freak people out. At one point he's doing this, he starts living in the backseat of his Cadillac with a cutout of Hank Williams. Like he's sitting in the back of his car with a cardboard cutout of Hank Williams. And so there is somebody walking around on planet Earth with a memory of standing on a street corner, seeing a just zooted up George Jones talking like Donald Duck to a cardboard cutout of Hank Williams. Like that happened to somebody. Somebody saw it, which was like, who would ever believe that story? But it happened a lot. And it happened to the point where everyone around George sees this happening and is kind of like unsure how to navigate this. And they, some of the band members tell a story. At one point, they're on the tour bus driving somewhere, and George Jones is doing his Donald Duck voice, and he's getting in a fight with Donald Duck to the point where, like, Donald Duck hurts George's feelings to the point where he kicks him off the bus. So he, like, makes the bus driver stop. George walks to the door and, like, kicks, figuratively, Donald Duck off the bus, right? Goes back and sits down, and the Donald Duck voice is gone. He's not doing that anymore because he just kicked him off the bus. They get down the road a little bit, but George starts feeling guilty that he kicked his friend off the bus, makes the bus driver turn around and go back to the spot where he kicked off Donald Duck, gets out of the bus, has a three-way conversation with himself, making up, and then gets back on the bus and starts talking like a duck again. And, like, at this point, everybody's had about enough of that because he's fully coming apart. And it's during this time that, like, he also, a lot of it, he's beating himself up over the Tammy Wynette thing. He's still super in love with Tammy Wynette, and she wants, at least at the time, she didn't want anything to do with him. But that's the point where his band members were like, if we cannot get him to shut up about the Tammy Wynette thing, and like he's coming apart, like why don't we just take him back to Nashville? And what if we get them to record together? Because I bet she would. And they were right. So him and Tammy Wynette start a little bit of a professional relationship where they record another couple songs together. And it does better than you would think with everything we just talked about. Like he went from like a three-way split personality to like kind of pulling it together and recording some pretty famous songs with Tammy Wynette. And so, and then that sort of continued. Like they continued a professional relationship even after the fact, which is wild to me, but I mean, seems to be the way it was. And he kind of, like I said, he sort of reins it back in enough to where there's a little bit of sunshine here, but not a lot. Like he's still drinking really heavy. And then this is 1980. He finally records "He Stopped Loving Her Today," which that, like I said, that song took him a long time to get done. And because he kept like changing how he would sing it, and he changed the melody a couple of times, anyway, so it took him a long time. They finally get "He Stopped Loving Her Today" done. It's released in 1980. It's a smashing success. That does reach number one, and it's his kind of crowning achievement. And then he follows up with another couple successes. He's "I Am What I Am," is his, platinum album. And then 1980, he wins a Grammy for Best Male Vocal Performance for "He Stopped Loving Her Today." I'm pretty sure that's the award ceremony where he's tripping all over himself and kind of trying to hold it together. But then pretty quickly after that is when his friends sort of pull together and they have an intervention for him. And one of those friends is Waylon Jennings, which is kind of wild. When you have a Waylon Jennings who is he's in knee deep in his own addiction struggle. When Waylon Jennings telling you to slow down, you must be in real trouble and he clearly was. So his friends, including Waylon Jennings, get together. They have an intervention. They convince him to go into a hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. So he does. And that seems to be a real turnaround. I don't know what the percentage of interventions are that work, but this one seems to have. And he describes going into the hospital. He said, "For the first 2 weeks, I hated everybody." He said, "But by the last couple of weeks, you kind of have a lot of time to think, and I had a lot of time to process stuff." So it seems to have the desired effect on him. Then, shortly there, almost immediately after he got out, he meets and marries a lady named Nancy Sepulvedo, so Nancy Jones, quickly thereafter. And she seems to be a real positive influence on George Jones's life. And they would stay married until, he died, many years later. But that relationship does seem to have really helped hold him together. And at the same time, so right around this happened, he ends up back in Texas, in his hometown, sort of. And because his sister and her husband had found this piece of land that they convinced George to buy and fix up. And so he's suddenly back in the woods of Texas, kind of getting his hands in the dirt and kind of fixing up his property and stuff. And it kind of keeps his mind off of his many problems. And so he gets kind of back to his roots in that way. He's got a relationship that is positive and kind of help keeping him on the rails in that way. So things start to, he really pulls his nose up out of that spiral and goes on to have many years of positive successes. He gets a TV show, just the George Jones Show, which there's a bunch of these that happen. There's George Jones had a TV show, Glenn Campbell had a TV show, Marty Robbins had a TV show. There's a bunch of these, and they're all kind of the same, where they're all interviewing and playing each other's music. It was just kind of a way to for the tide to raise all the boats, I guess, at the same time. And so, but George Jones is one of the more successful ones. And that's on TV for a long time. And anyway, so then he continues to release hits. So he had Billboard hits in 5 decades, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And let's see here. So then Burn Your Playhouse Down was in 2008. Now that was kind of he did a bunch of duets and stuff with some contemporary artists at the time. That's what we're into, the phase where he's singing songs like "I Don't Need Your Rocking Chair" or "Who's Gonna Fill Their Shoes." This is when we start getting this sort of, the songs have an attitude of they're appropriately timed, they're sung by a man in kind of the later part of his life, and that's sort of the theme of his songs kind of going forward. And but they're doing great. I mean, he's still cranking out hits. Let's see here. I mean, George Jones, to his credit, he toured pretty much right up until the moment he died. I mean, so he dies in 2013, at 81 years old, which is way older than you would have thought he would have ever made it, judging by some of the footage you can find of him in the 70s and 80s. I mean, this guy was just burning it down from both ends. But he made, like I said, he kind of pulled his life together. He got into a healthy marriage, and he managed to, go on into legend. And I mean, and his influence and his, vocally and the songs that he picked and just his mark that he left on country music will always be there. And he sort of had a big influence on the next wave of artists, which was like Alan Jackson and Vince Gill and guys like that kind of picked it up and carried the torch for him. And, but yeah, and he was a good, steward of the country music scene all the way until the day he died. I think his last performance was only like a couple of weeks before he died. And so, just another legend and another unbelievable artist. So, but yeah, that is George Jones. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week.